A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke, chapter 2, verses 22 to 40. Passage taken from the Message version of the Bible. Then, when the days stipulated by Moses for purification were complete, they took him up to Jerusalem to offer him to God as commanded in God's law. Every male who opens the womb shall be a holy offering to God, and also to sacrifice the pair of doves or two young pigeons prescribed in God's law. In Jerusalem at the time, there was a man, Simeon by name, a good man, a man who lived in the prayerful expectancy of help for Israel. And the Holy Spirit was on him. The Holy Spirit had shown him that he would see the Messiah of God before he died. Led by the Spirit, he entered the temple. As the parents of the child Jesus brought him to carry out the rituals of the law, Simeon took him into his arms and blessed God. God, you can now release your servant. Release me in peace as you promised. With my own eyes I have seen your salvation. It's now out in the open for everyone to see. A God revealing light to the non-Jewish nations and of glory for your people Israel. Jesus' father and mother were speechless with surprise at these words. Simeon went on to bless them and said to Mary his mother, "This child marks both the failure and the recovery of many in Israel. A figure misunderstood and contradicted, the pain of a sword thrust through you, but the rejection will force honesty as God reveals who they really are." The Gospel of the Lord. Reflections on the Gospel according to Luke chapter 2 verses 22 to 35. Now I can die. This is how the Gospel presents the serene figure of Simeon in vivid contrast to the tortured Herod, slayer of the innocents, who got a mention in the Gospel yesterday. Herod's death became legendary for its awfulness, but Simeon can teach us how to approach death, how not to see death as an enemy, the prince of terrors, how not to define it as the destruction of life, but to welcome it as a culmination, a completion. If we have not lived our lives faithfully and fruitfully, we will be terrified of death. If Simeon could approach death so peacefully, he must have lived a deep life. Unlike Herod, he must have fought the war within and come to peace with himself and with others and with God. Now, Lord, you can let your servant go in peace. Simeon's canticle is a beautiful closing of the day, a lesson on how to end things, how to approach the end of life, and how to take one's leave. He is prepared for a peaceful departure. He spent his entire life in waiting for the consolation of the people of Israel. His waiting reached a blessed end when Jesus entered the temple with his parents. He was able to experience the fulfillment of God's promises because his whole life was in resonance with God's voice. The story of Simeon teaches that our hopes will be realized someday, if not immediately, and God will fulfill every one of his promises. But God's way does not always correspond our way. Simeon was waiting for the glorious Messiah of Israel. My eyes have seen the salvation which you have made ready in the sight of the nations, a light of revelation for the Gentiles and glory for your people Israel. In a weak, defenseless child, Simeon shows us how to end each day, how to end a year, and our life itself in peace with God. Simeon personifies the history of Israel. He represents the people who, in spite of all the conflicts and deviations from faith and God, continue to trust in the new future that God had promised them. Simeon also personifies the story of any person in search with the possibility of welcoming Emmanuel, God with us, and announcing the novelty of his kingdom. We need more elders like Simeon, also young and middle aged people, that from the experience of a life lived in confidence and faith, they transmit that confidence and faith to those who come from behind. You too can be a Simeon. Do you believe it?